All right. Welcome to my virtual presentation here at our virtual conference. My name is Jennifer Picard. I work in cultural resources management at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And my presentation is titled Identity and Dinner, the Interpretive Potential of Plant Macroremains. And I'm going to talk a little bit about plant macroremains, the methods involved in retrieving them, the sorts of things they can tell us, and also contextualize what that might mean for the sites, the garden bed sites on the Menominee Reservation. I'm also going to give a little bit of background for what I know about plant remains elsewhere in Wisconsin, contemporaneous with these sites, to help get an idea of the ways in which plant macroremains can be interpretive tools. I like to remember that although plant remains are a natural object, they're a seed or a root or a rind. They're not artifacts in the sense that pottery or projectile points are. However, when we're talking about cultivated or domesticated plants, we are talking about natural objects that have been altered through human actions. So in many ways, they are, in fact, artifacts. So the major cultural groups that I'm going to be referencing in this presentation are based on what we call ceramic cultures, basically the types of pottery that people made at a particular time and place. These are, of course, imperfect cultural groupings that probably don't match up to the way that people think of themselves or thought of themselves as groups of people. And choosing to use a ceramic tradition to define a cultural group is obviously making a choice to use that and not something else. For example, not, say, foodways or hunting patterns or residential patterns, something like that, although we do associate ceramic traditions with other lifeways. So of course this is a taxonomic category and not a real human category. That being said, I'm going to talk about three main ceramic traditions in this presentation. The first one is the late woodland period, and particularly late woodland peoples who made something called collardware, which are ceramic vessels with a thickened area around the rim that probably served a functional purpose, though we don't necessarily know what that is. This pottery was produced circa 800 to 1200 and largely in southeastern Wisconsin, although there is some in the driftless area of western Wisconsin and some in northeastern Illinois as well. This pottery is similar to pottery seen in the northeastern United States, including in the New York area. And the reason that this is the particular late woodland group that I talk about the most is because this type of pottery is highly associated with finding corn, maize macroremains on archaeological sites in Wisconsin, less so than other late woodland pottery types are. The other two ceramic cultures that I'm going to discuss here are known as Middle and Upper Mississippian. And the defining characteristic of Middle and Upper Mississippian is that they are associated with thin, walled, shell-tempered pottery, as opposed to the earlier grit-tempered pottery associated with the late woodland period. And I say earlier, although there is definitely an overlap between the two. Middle Mississippian pottery is often ornately incised, not always, and demonstrates some connection to events happening in the American Bottom region of Illinois, beginning circa AD 1050 or so. The main site that we see this type of pottery at in Wisconsin is the site of Aztalan in Jefferson County. And the degree of interaction with people down at the Cahokia site, the famous Middle Mississippian city in the American Bottom, is unknown. However, there is probably some degree of fairly direct interaction because elements that are seen of mound building, pottery production, and ritual activity seen at Aztalan are very similar to those seen at Cahokia. So with this pottery culture, we're seeing sort of 1050 AD, and really Aztlan is probably abandoned by about 1300, if not earlier. Abandoned being a poor choice of words, but certainly not used very much until there is a later historic period settlement at the site. Now, Upper Mississippian is also shell-tempered pottery, and the degree to which that is connected to Middle Mississippian activities in the region is really not understood. There's probably, again, some degree of connection there, not as direct as what we see at Aztlan. And we really see the Upper Mississippian tradition showing up contemporaneous with the Middle Mississippian tradition circa the 12th or 13th century. Again, both of these traditions are typically associated with corn agriculture and a more permanent settlement structure. The Upper Mississippian cultures not associated with mound construction, and the ceramic designs are a bit different. The Upper Mississippian tradition continues from that early 11th century time frame through to the time of European settlement, most likely, although things get a little bit fuzzy as far as what was going on right around the time of European contact. The basic idea here is that Middle Mississippian is a brief period. Very few sites in Wisconsin, again, mainly the Aztlan site, reflect that ceramic culture, whereas the Upper Mississippian tradition is much more broadly seen throughout the state. And it's debated whether or not that cultural tradition comes from in situ evolution, which is a very bad term for it, of the local late woodland traditions into a more agricultural lifestyle, or the importing of agricultural traditions from the South. As we'll talk about in my presentation, that's also a very limited understanding because the local late woodland people were definitely already engaging in agriculture before the Middle Mississippian characteristics show up on the scene. The degree to which those characteristics were brought by Middle Mississippian people, again, being up for debate. Okay, enough of my very brief culture history. Let me talk briefly about paleoethnobotanical methods and what that can show us about ancient diets. How do we find out what people are eating and growing? Now, for a long time, the only plant remains that were collected from sites were the large, obvious things like whole corn cobs or large clusters of seeds stored in pouches, groups of nuts that were fairly obvious, and these were often found in dry rock shelter situations where plant remains preserve very well, or if they were charred, they were found just by screening or by looking at them. You weren't going to be finding very tiny seeds this way. So that created a certain interpretation of what ancient diets were like. This was coupled with ethnographic accounts to paint a picture of indigenous agriculture that was based very much on the Three Sisters cropping system, which is seen among the Iroquoian groups. It's a very mutualist system of agriculture where maize serves as the stake to grow the beans, the pole for the pole beans, and squash serves as a sort of natural mulch to keep moisture in the ground. It's a very efficient system. The beans put nitrogen back into the soil for the maize, and it works very well. It is the process of centuries of experimentation. And this was just assumed, projected ethnographically backwards in time and assumed to be how things always have been. However, as so many things happened in the 1960s, there were some developments that caused a change in this interpretation. Okay, so in the 1960s, there was what we like to call the flotation revolution in archaeological practice. Basically, the idea is that you can take soil samples and quote unquote float them in water, agitated water, and from this you can retrieve smaller seeds that you are not going to find via ordinary screening through hardware mesh, much smaller items, allowing you to get a much more complete idea of what people are actually eating. Now, the way that seeds get preserved in the archaeological record is via three methods. The first is very waterlogged contexts. Now, these are pretty rare here in Wisconsin, although I have seen some very old squash rind get preserved at the bottom of a midden that was on a river, and therefore usually always wet. Bacteria don't like a permanently waterlogged context, and therefore things don't decompose as quickly. Another way is dry rock shelter context, which certainly do exist here in the Midwest. It's just too dry for the bacteria that normally decompose food to become active. But those are pretty rare situations, and you might argue that what you are finding in those locations are more likely to be stashes of things than sort of the detritus of everyday meals. And then the other sort of miraculous way that seeds get preserved is by becoming burnt. Once floral material is burned, it actually does not decompose any further, although it can become broken apart through the freeze-thaw cycle. So you'll get tiny fragments of things and also small seeds through this flotation method. Obviously, plant matter floats while other things sink. And then you can look at things under a microscope to identify them. So through this method, we were able to get a much more clear picture of ancient diets. And one thing that was discovered was that certain plants were showing up a lot. Chenopodium, sunflower, little barley, knotweed, echinocloa or barnyard grass, and squash show up a lot in the eastern United States and the upper Midwest. These are what is called the Eastern Agricultural Complex. Now, just because these seeds are being collected and eaten doesn't mean they're being deliberately cultivated. And one of the breakthroughs that indicated that they were deliberately cultivated was the discovery of Chenopodium, or goosefoot, being deliberately selected for more desirable plants. So you start seeing larger seeds, which are both easier to plant and more pleasant to eat, with thinner seed coats, again, better for eating. And being able to look at these through a scanning electron microscope demonstrates the differences between domesticated and wild Chenopodium seeds. This Eastern Agricultural Complex is considered to be the sort of local, a local center of domestication, a spontaneous, not spontaneous, but a center of domestication that is not imported from someplace else. So just as maize is domesticated in Central America, these plants are domesticated right here in North America, and that's considered quite significant, something that we did not know before the flotation revolution. Now, even following this flotation revolution, there's a bit of an assumption that maize comes from the south. So even if people here in the upper Midwest are growing these native cultigens, that maize really would not be showing up here in Wisconsin until the Middle Mississippians arrive and bring maize and cultural innovations to Wisconsin. The evidence, however, does not really bear that out. We start seeing maize in Wisconsin during the late woodland period. And what is somewhat surprising is that these native cultigens, while they start being pretty significant in western Wisconsin as early as the middle woodland period, at these collared ware late woodland sites, there actually aren't that many of them. You see generally maize, you see a little bit of chenopodium, and you see wild plants, particularly nutshell, in this late woodland period. And I'll talk about some case studies here in a second. Here's just my very simple map of where Aztalan is in Wisconsin and where Cahokia is in Illinois. And this is just my best case study of that sort of collared ware late woodland dietary pattern compared to what is seen down in the American bottom. What's really interesting is that collared ware pattern actually seems to rely less on those native cultigens, although they are using corn, which is from Central America, and the contemporaneous sites down in the American bottom surrounding Cahokia appear to rely more on those native cultigens. And my case study about Aztalan here depends on a very quick understanding of Aztalan's occupational sequence. I have here a profile of the riverbank midden, which I spoke about briefly before. The lowest strata of this midden are pretty waterlogged, and sometimes uncarbonized plant remains will survive. What's important to know about Aztalan is it's not as if it sprung up wholesale on the banks of the Crawfish River in Jefferson County from nothing when the Middle Mississippian mounds that characterize the site are built. There was already a late woodland community here, and this lower stratum of the midden has only late woodland pottery. And I analyzed plant remains from there, as well as from the upper strata, which represent the time period where most likely people who practiced a late woodland lifestyle and Middle Mississippian influenced or imports from the south were living at the site. It's just a really good case study in how the diet changes once that Middle Mississippian cultural tradition becomes part of the scene. And again, you're wondering what this has to do with the sites in the Menominee Reservation, but bear with me. This is a really good diachronic example of how something changes and based on cultural patterns, how diets change. Again, we are what we eat, and food is very important to our culture, as I'm sure everyone listening understands. So in the late woodland contexts, you see some maize. Densities of maize are low, but it's certainly present. And there's no squash to speak of. There is quite a lot of nutshell, and at Aztalan, almost invariably the nutshell is hickory nutshell. Hickory is very easy to process rather than having to individually break open every nut you're going to eat, which is very time consuming, and I wouldn't want to do it as my main dietary source. You can actually just crush the nuts up, boil hickory nuts, and the fat from the nuts will sort of float to the top of the water when it cools off and make almost a butter that you could spread on anything or just eat with a spoon, like peanut butter out of a jar. So it's a very useful nut to have around. And it's also a nut that is easy to sort of not cultivate, but some sort of arboriculture where groves of hickory could be managed as a food source. So that seems to be very important during the solely late woodland occupation at the site. Now then all of a sudden, Middle Mississippian pottery is present at the site, and it appears that that is associated with a dietary shift. Now again, the nutshell, still important, but not as important. You see a lower density of it. The maize becomes almost twice as important in the diet, and squash shows up for the first time. That's somewhat to be expected with the understanding of, oh, the Mississippians are maize agriculturalists and the late woodland people are dabbling in maize horticulture, but they are more dependent on wild resources. Okay, sure. Okay, the late woodland people at Aztalan are probably managing groves of hickory trees. They are also growing at least some corn, but what aren't they growing at all, apparently? Those Eastern agricultural complex plants, the ones that are domesticated right here in North America, don't seem to really be playing a role. Now, I looked at a lot of other collardware late woodland sites in northeastern Illinois and southeastern Wisconsin, and I found that pattern really pretty much holds. There is maize, but there's a lot of use of nut still, and there's just not a lot of those Eastern agricultural complex plants, certainly not as much as you see at the sites in the American bottom. And if you look at my chart here, once the Mississippian pottery shows up at Aztalan, the amount of chenopodium and features goes through the roof. It just becomes a lot more important. And that's not necessarily what you might expect to see if you're assuming that Eastern agricultural complex is what's native to North America, and then the Mississippians bring this maize technology from further south. That cultural association of what's being grown doesn't seem to only be reflective in terms of what species are being grown, but also in terms of cultivars of specific plants. And I'm going to talk about corn or maize here, and that's going to really tie into what I'm seeing at the Menominee Garden Bed sites. Okay, so typically we talk about two kinds of maize when we talk about maize agriculture in Eastern North America. And I'm not even touching on what's going on in the American Southwest because, frankly, that's beyond my area of expertise. Throughout most of the northeastern United States and Canada, we have something called Eastern 8-row, which is 8-row maize that is related to the modern landrace of northern flint corn. It is very well adapted to the cold, and there seems to be an association between this type of maize and that collardware pottery. I mentioned earlier that collardware pottery is possibly related to what's going on in northeastern North America on the eastern seaboard in New York. This maize also appears to perhaps be coming through the Great Lakes. So you get this pottery style coming via the Great Lakes, and then this Eastern 8-row maize, it shows up in the Northeast, it shows up in Michigan, and it shows up in Eastern Wisconsin first. It is the first kind of corn to show up in Eastern Wisconsin. Simultaneously, down in the American bottom, the earliest kind of, down in the American bottom, which is where the Cahokia site is that we mentioned before, the earliest kind of maize that is showing up there is 12-row maize. And these distinctions are based upon measuring often fragmentary cobs. So it's not a perfect thing to look at a fragment of a corn cob and say, okay, this is a 12-row cob, because obviously things can become distorted when they are burned. But there do seem to be genetic differences between these two kinds of corn, to the point where some of the genetic analysis on Eastern 8-row maize has suggested it's almost a separate species from the 12-row maize and the dent corn that we tend to see in the South. It's very well adapted to this northern latitude. So while the morphological difference of 8-row versus 12-row is an imperfect science, there does appear to be some very strong genetic distinction. I'm now going to embark on a sort of tour de force of maize race in eastern Wisconsin. I will start back at Aztalan and also talk about a nearby group of upper Mississippian sites. So that's that more local shell-tempered pottery culture without the dramatic platform mounds. These are four sites located on Lake Koshkonong. So we call that the Koshkonong locality. And primarily I will be talking about maize from the Crescent Bay Hunt Club site, which is marked as CBHC on this map. Okay, here's a little plot showing the late woodland and Mississippian strata at Aztalan, as well as maize from the Crescent Bay Hunt Club site. Now you notice actually there's not really a statistically significant difference between the late woodland and the Mississippian maize at Aztalan, and I don't know if that's simply error from the measurements, which were taken by me but could have been affected by distortion, or if it's the fact that Aztalan is a site of extreme cultural interaction, and maybe more than one type of maize is being grown as a sort of buffer against climatic issues or for various cultural reasons that are beyond my understanding. What's really interesting is the Crescent Bay Hunt Club site, that upper Mississippian site to the south of Aztalan, which is roughly contemporaneous and a little bit later than Aztalan, so we're looking at about 1200 here. That is all 12 to 16 row maize. So it's all that higher row number that my literature review tells me to associate with the American bottom, which is really interesting because there's no Middle Mississippian pottery there. There's no evidence of any direct connection to that region. To continue this tour of eastern Wisconsin maize, there is another site on Lake Koshkonong, this time on the sort of the southeast shore of Lake Koshkonong, called the Finch site. Now, all of the features that I looked at this site for corn were late woodland features, and I found all 8-row maize. And at the golf course site on the shores of Lake Winnebago in Winnebago County, late woodland features also produced 8-row maize. Now this one is interesting, or at least I think it is interesting. This is the McCauley site, which is also located on Lake Winnebago. But this is a feature that probably, based on other artifacts recovered, dates to the Oneota time period, and I don't have an exact date, and unfortunately the pottery is not sufficiently diagnostic for me to know whether that's early Oneota, like 1200, or later, closer to the time of European contact. But what I will say is it was absolutely 8-row maize, 100% 8-row maize, and I know that because for one of the first times in my life I had an entire cob of corn to look at. It was very exciting. So I would love to get a date on that, funds allowing. But we're seeing in presumably a later context, more contemporaneous with that Crescent Bay Hunt Club site where we saw the 12 to 16 row maize, we're seeing that eastern 8-row still. And that brings us finally to the sites on the Menominee Reservation. The only samples that I have yet had the chance to look at are from the Joe Dick Road site, and they have been from contexts in the garden beds themselves, so levels in the garden beds, and not from features. So what I have found is, perhaps unsurprisingly, not a lot of plant macroremains. They, as we know, only preserve as carbonized materials in most cases, and you're just not going to find as much burned plant matter in a garden bed as you might in a trash pit where you're burning to get rid of, the smell of rotting food. But you will find some carbonized material because you're probably adding some ash to your soil or burning fields periodically. I have not found much in the way of other plants, not much in the way of those Eastern agricultural complex plants. What I have found are a few maize cupules, and one of those was dated and fell right in that sort of 1200 to 1300 time range. Now that is, following the appearance of Middle Mississippian pottery at Aztalan, which is considerably to the south, but we know that people traveled, and possibly the people up in Menominee County were aware of what was going on at Aztalan. And certainly the site, there's 12 row maize in Wisconsin at this time, but we're continuing to see the use of 8-row maize. Now, this isn't shocking if we think about this in terms of the late woodland cultural pattern in terms of foodways. We see very little of that Eastern agricultural complex material, although once we're looking at the features a bit more, we might see more of it. We're seeing corn. It's 8-row corn. Now, does that speak to the cultural affiliations? Do you grow 8-row corn because of who your ancestors were and what they knew and what they grew, just like you make the pottery your ancestors made? To what degree is that an environmental adaptation? As I talked about before, that corn is very adapted to growing in a colder climate. So even if you know people down in southern Wisconsin where it's a little bit warmer, who are growing this newfangled 12-row maize, you might say, well, I'm going to keep growing this 8-row maize because it's what works up here. Again, these are small sample sizes in general for this maize row analysis. We need more data, and in particular, we need more genetic data on residue analysis and so forth, and more direct genetic analysis on the existing land races that descend from these ancient types of maize. But I think it's a very interesting road of inquiry because we often think about looking at pottery to tell us who is living where and their cultural identity. But culture is very tied up with what we're eating. And I do think it's very interesting that you can tie the type of corn that's being grown to some extent with the type of pottery that's being used. And so there may be an aspect of cultural tradition in terms of what's being grown, and that is not independent of the environmental factors. Well, that was a very long way of saying that 8-row maize is present at the Joe Dick Road site, but I hope that provides some cultural context, and I want to thank Dr. Overstreet for inviting me to participate in this conference. It's a little too bad that we had to do it virtually, although thank goodness for the technology to still be able to share our ideas with each other, and hopefully we will all be able to meet in person sooner than we think. Thank you.